The snow fell silently as Lord Adrien Blackwood stood motionless before the altar of St. Margaret's Church, his jaw clenched tight enough to shatter teeth. Behind him, 300 guests whispered their pity and their scorn in equal measure. The bride was late. Of course she was late. This woman he had never met, never wanted to meet, whose face he had deliberately refused to see in portraits or miniatures, was now keeping him waiting like a fool before all of London society. His hands, clasped behind his back, were white-knuckled with fury. 2 months ago, his father's debts had been revealed. Gambling debts so catastrophic they would have destroyed the Blackwood name entirely. The solution had arrived in the form of Theodore Ashford, a shipping magnate whose new wealth needed the legitimacy of old blood. The arrangement was simple. Adrienne would marry Ashford's daughter, and the debts would disappear like morning mist. He had one condition. He would not look at her until the ceremony itself. He would not pretend affection where there was only transaction. He would not lie. Now, as the church doors creaked open and gasps rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat, Adrien kept his gaze fixed rigidly forward, his pride the only armor he had left. The whispers crescendoed into something approaching chaos. Adrien felt, rather than saw, his best friend, Lord Christopher Ashton, stiffen beside him at the altar. Even the Archbishop faltered mid-breath, his aged eyes widening with something that looked remarkably like shock. What fresh humiliation was this? Had the bride arrived in rags? Had she brought her merchant father's entire staff as attendants? Adrien's fingers curled into fists. He had endured 2 months of London's barely concealed mockery. The Duke sold himself like livestock to save his family's crumbling legacy. He had borne his mother's tears and his sister's disappointed silence. He would not, could not, turn around now and give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing his reaction. The organ began its processional march, each note falling like a hammer blow. Behind him, the rustling of 300 people rising to their feet seemed to echo in the vaulted ceiling. Still, Adrien stared ahead at the stained glass window of St. Michael with his flaming sword and wished desperately for such divine intervention. The footsteps approaching down the aisle were light, measured, graceful. The scent of orange blossom drifted forward on the cold church air. And still, stubbornly, Adrien refused to look. Adrien had not always been carved from ice and bitterness. There had been a time, years ago, when he had laughed freely and loved recklessly. Her name had been Catherine, and she had been the daughter of a country vicar. He had been 22, newly returned from Oxford, full of idealistic notions about marrying for love rather than duty. His father, the old Duke, had crushed that dream with the efficiency of a boot heel on a flower. Catherine had been paid off and sent away. Adrien never learned where. The old Duke died 6 months later, leaving behind a title, 3 estates, and debts that would have made a usurer weep. Adrien had spent 8 years rebuilding what his father had destroyed, selling off properties, dismissing servants, living like a monk in a crumbling abbey. He had been so close to solvency, so desperately close. Then the gambling debts surfaced. Secret ones, catastrophic ones. Theodore Ashford had appeared like a devil offering bargains. His daughter needed a title. Adrien needed money. Simple mathematics. Adrien had agreed with one bitter condition. He would not pretend this was anything but a transaction. He would not court her, would not see her, would not offer false hope of affection that had died in him years ago when Catherine disappeared. Now she was walking toward him, this stranger who would bear his name, and every eye in the church was fixed not on him, but on her. The gasps had faded into a breathless silence that somehow felt worse. Adrien's throat constricted, his heart hammered against his ribs like a prisoner seeking escape. Just a few more moments, then he could look. Then he would have to look. The footsteps stopped beside him. The Archbishop cleared his throat, and Adrien finally turned his head. The woman standing beside him was not what he expected. He had braced himself for merchant-class garishness, for over-loud colors and excessive jewels of new money trying too hard. Instead, she wore the simplest wedding gown he had ever seen, ivory silk that fell in clean lines without a single ruffle or ribbon. No veil covered her face, no jewelry adorned her throat, but it was her face that had caused the gasps. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that London society worshipped. Her features were too strong for that. A determined chin, a nose with a slight bump that suggested it had once been broken, dark eyebrows that arched with intelligence rather than artifice. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, almost gold in the candlelight, and they met his gaze directly, without coyness or submission. But it was the scar that drew the eye and held it captive. It ran from her left temple down across her cheekbone, disappearing beneath the high collar of her gown. Not a delicate, ladylike mark, but a brutal thing, puckered silver white against her olive skin, the kind of scar that told stories of violence and survival. Adrien felt something crack in his chest, something he had thought frozen beyond all thawing. Not pity, she would despise pity. He knew that instantly. Something else. Recognition, perhaps. Here was someone else who wore their wounds on the outside. Her lips curved in the smallest smile. "Lord Blackwood," she said quietly, "shall we proceed?" Her voice was slightly husky, with an accent he couldn't quite place. The ceremony passed in a blur of ritual words and binding vows. Adrien heard himself speaking as if from a great distance, his responses automatic. Beside him, his bride, Isabel. He remembered her name was Isabel. Repeated her own vows in that same calm, composed voice. Her hand, when he took it to slide the ring onto her finger, was steady. His own trembled slightly. He hated that she might have noticed. When the archbishop pronounced them man and wife, Adrien turned to perform the ceremonial kiss. It would be brief, perfunctory, nothing more than a brushing of lips to satisfy propriety. But as he leaned toward Isabel, she tilted her head slightly, and her amber eyes caught his with an expression that was almost amused. "You may kiss your bride, Lord Blackwood," she murmured. "I promise not to bite." The comment was so unexpected, so utterly inappropriate for the sanctity of the moment, that Adrien felt his mouth twitch despite himself. He pressed his lips to hers quickly, meaning to pull away immediately, but something made him linger, just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Her lips were soft and warm, and she smelled of orange blossom and something else, something like sunshine and foreign spices. When he stepped back, her expression remained serene, but there was a glint in those unusual eyes that suggested she was laughing at him, or perhaps at the entire absurd situation. They turned to face the congregation as husband and wife. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, applause began, polite, uncertain, growing gradually stronger. Adrien offered his arm, and Isabel placed her hand upon it with a lightness that somehow felt deliberate. As they walked down the aisle together, Adrien was acutely aware of every whisper. The wedding breakfast at Blackwood House was an exercise in exquisite torture. Adrien watched his new wife navigate the social minefield with a grace that surprised him. She did not simper or hide. When Lady Piton made a pointed comment about unusual bridal beauty, Isabel smiled serenely and thanked her for the compliment. When Lord Ashton's mother asked with false sweetness where she had acquired her scar, Isabel replied, "A gift from a runaway horse in Seville. I was 10. The horse, unpleasant to report, survived unscathed." The answer was delivered with such dry wit that several guests laughed before they could stop themselves. Adrien found himself studying her between his obligatory conversations with well-wishers. She sat at the head of the table beside him, her posture perfect, her responses measured and intelligent. She did not touch him, did not attempt false intimacy. She played her role as flawlessly as he played his. It should have been a relief. Instead, it unsettled him. When the last guest finally departed, and the servants began clearing the debris of celebration, Adrien found himself alone with Isabel in the grand drawing room. The silence between them stretched taut as wire. She stood by the window, looking out at the London twilight, her profile outlined in fading light. "Your rooms are in the East Wing," Adrien said, his voice rougher than intended. "I've had your belongings moved there. My chambers are in the West Wing. We need not. That is, I don't expect marital relations." Isabel turned to face him, one eyebrow arched. "How fortunate." "I don't expect them either," Adrien blinked. In his experience, young brides were either terrified of the marriage bed or resignedly dutiful about it. Isabel seemed utterly indifferent, however. She continued, "We should discuss the practical arrangements of this marriage." Adrien gestured to the settee, and Isabel seated herself with the same economical grace she brought to every movement. He took the chair opposite, maintaining a careful distance. In the low lamplight, her scar seemed less stark, just another shadow among many. "My father has paid your debts," Isabel began without preamble. "All of them. In return, I have your name and your protection." "I believe those were the terms agreed upon." "They were," Adrien confirmed, disliking how cold it sounded when stated so plainly. "I have no intention of being a burden to you, Lord Blackwood. I don't require entertainment or constant companionship. I read extensively. I ride when weather permits, and I have certain charitable interests that occupy my time." She folded her hands in her lap. "I ask only 3 things. First, that you treat me with basic courtesy in public. Second, that you do not interfere with my correspondence or movements. And third," she paused, her amber eyes meeting his directly, "that you do not take a mistress while residing under the same roof as me. I have no objection to discretion conducted elsewhere, but I will not be humiliated in my own home." The frankness of her terms left Adrienne momentarily speechless. This was not how gently bred ladies spoke, even in the privacy of marriage. "And what do I receive in return for these concessions? A wife who will manage your household efficiently, represent your name with dignity, and never burden you with emotional demands you have no desire to meet." Her smile was slight, knowing, "I believe we understand each other, my lord. Neither of us wanted this marriage, but we need not make each other miserable in the living of it." It was reasonable, practical, everything Adrienne had thought he wanted. So why did it feel like a door closing on something he hadn't known he still hoped for? If you're wondering what happens when two wounded souls agree to a marriage of convenience, but fate has other plans, well, you'll want to hear what comes next. The first month of marriage passed in a strange dance of avoidance and unwilling awareness. Adrienne kept to his chambers and his study, managing estate business with grim efficiency. Isabelle, true to her word, made no demands upon him. She ran the household with a competence that surprised the staff and earned their respect. She rose early, took her breakfast alone, and spent her mornings in the library or riding in Hyde Park before the fashionable hours. They dined together when social obligation required it, their conversation polite and impersonal. Yet Adrienne found himself noticing things, the way she always chose the chair nearest the fire, as if perpetually cold, the slight limp she tried to hide on rainy days, the fact that she received no letters from her father, but corresponded regularly with someone in Spain, the letter sealed with deep red wax. One evening, returning late from his club, Adrienne heard music drifting from the music room. He paused outside the door, listening. Isabelle was playing the pianoforte, not the serene, delicate pieces young ladies perform to showcase their accomplishments, but something wild and passionate, full of fury and longing. Spanish, he thought. The music spoke of sun-baked earth and ancient sorrows. When it ended, the silence felt profound. Adrienne found himself pushing open the door before he could reconsider. Isabelle sat at the instrument, her head bowed, her fingers still resting on the keys. In the candlelight, she looked smaller, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. She started, turning to face him. For just a moment, her expression was unguarded, lonely, raw, achingly human. Then the mask slid back into place. "I apologize if I disturbed you." "You didn't." Adrienne stepped into the room. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Something shifted in Isabelle's expression, a calculation happening behind those amber eyes. Then, as if reaching a decision, she said, "My mother was Spanish, from Seville." "She taught you?" Adrienne asked gently. "She died when I was 12, 2 years after the horse threw me." Isabelle's fingers moved absently over the keys, not pressing down, just ghosting across them. "My father brought me to England afterward. He thought a fresh start would help me forget. Instead, I simply learned to be to people, the English merchant's daughter in public, and my mother's child in private." Adrienne found himself moving closer, drawn by the quiet honesty in her voice. "Is that why you asked about correspondence? You're writing to family in Spain, my mother's sister. She's all I have left of that life." Isabelle looked up at him. "Your turn, Lord Blackwood." Why did a duke who could have had his pick of eligible aristocrats agree to marry a scarred merchant's daughter he refused to even look at? The question was direct, almost challenging. Adrienne could have deflected, could have retreated behind her aristocratic coldness. Instead, he found himself saying, "Because I had already sold everything else. My pride was all I had left to bargain with. And now I find myself wondering if pride is worth the price of loneliness." The words hung between them, more confession than Adrienne had intended. Isabelle studied him for a long moment, then shifted on the piano bench, making room. "Do you play?" "Not in years." "Then perhaps it's time to remember." It wasn't quite an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Adrienne sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She began to play again, something slower this time, and showed him the melody with patient hands. Spring arrived with a fury of blossoms and sudden warmth that transformed London's grey streets into something almost beautiful. Adrienne found himself spending more time at home, inventing excuses to linger over breakfast when Isabelle took her tea, joining her for evening rides through the park. They spoke of inconsequential things, books they had read, observations about London society. the progress of the garden at Blackwood House. But underneath the polite conversation, something else was growing, an awareness that made Adrienne's pulse quicken. When Isabel entered a room, a tension that thrummed between them when their hands accidentally brushed. It came to a head one afternoon when Adrienne returned home to find Isabel in the garden, kneeling in the dirt without gloves, her riding habit mud-stained, her hair escaping its pins. She was transplanting roses with fierce concentration, and there was dirt smudged across her scarred cheek. "What are you doing?" he asked. Unable to keep the amusement from his voice, Isabel looked up, and for the first time since their wedding, she smiled at him, really smiled, bright and unguarded. "Your gardens were dying. I couldn't bear it any longer. These roses were my mother's favorite." She thought she trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. Adrienne knelt beside her in the dirt, heedless of his expensive trousers. Thought what? That perhaps something beautiful could grow here after all. She wasn't looking at the roses anymore. She was looking at him. Adrienne reached out slowly, enough that she could pull away if she wished, and wiped the smudge of dirt from her cheek. His thumb lingered on the ridge of her scar, tracing it gently. "Isabel," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I need to tell you something about Catherine." And they're in the garden, with dirt under their fingernails and the scent of roses in the air. Adrienne told her everything. Isabel listened without interruption as Adrienne spoke of Catherine, of young love crushed by duty, of the bitterness that had calcified in his chest for 8 long years. When he finished, they sat in silence, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. "I understand now," Isabel said finally, "why you wouldn't look at me. You didn't want another woman forced upon you by circumstance." "I was a coward," Adrienne corrected. "I was so afraid of being hurt again that I hurt you instead. From the moment you walked down that aisle, you deserved better than my coldness. And yet you're here now, in the dirt, listening to me ramble about roses." Isabel's smile was soft, tentative. "Perhaps we're both learning." Adrienne took her hand, muddy as it was, and held it gently. "I don't want a marriage of convenience anymore, Isabel. I want more, if you'll have me, if I haven't destroyed any chance of." She kissed him. It was sudden and sweet, tasting of earth and possibility. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "You stubborn, wounded, ridiculous man. Did you truly think I asked for separate chambers because I didn't want you? I was protecting myself, Adrienne, protecting my heart from a husband who had made it abundantly clear he wanted no part of me. I was wrong." Adrienne breathed, cupping her face with both hands, careful of her scar, treasuring it as part of her. "So profoundly wrong. You are extraordinary, Isabel. You have been from the moment you stood beside me at that altar and smiled at my coldness. I have been falling in love with you for weeks, and I was too much a fool to admit it." "Then admit it now," she whispered. "Say it plainly. I love you." The words came easily, naturally, as if they had been waiting years to be spoken. "I love your strength and your wit and your terrible habit of kneeling in gardens, without proper gloves." The transformation of Blackwood House began that day in the garden and rippled outward like rings in water. Adrienne moved his belongings to the chambers adjoining Isabel's. The connecting door between them left perpetually open. They took breakfast together every morning, their conversation ranging from estate matters to philosophy to Isabel's memories of Spain. Adrienne began learning Spanish from her, stumbling over the unfamiliar rhythms while she laughed and corrected his pronunciation. With patient affection. At night, they came together with a tenderness that astonished them both. Adrienne traced every scar on Isabel's body. She had more than the one on her face, remnants of a childhood spent running wild under the Spanish sun, and told her she was beautiful until she believed him. She in turn learned the landscape of his body, the places he carried tension, the touches that made him gasp and surrender. They hosted a ball at Blackwood House, their first as a true married couple. London society came expecting scandal or coldness and found instead a duke and duchess, who moved through the evening in perfect harmony, who smiled at private jokes, who danced together 3 times, twice more than propriety allowed, and didn't care who noticed. Lady Piton, never one to leave well enough alone, cornered Isabel near the refreshments. "How remarkable, Your Grace, that Lord Blackwood seems so changed. One might almost think this marriage was a love match rather than a financial arrangement." Isabel met her gaze steadily, a slight smile playing at her lips. "One might think," she agreed, "that love can grow anywhere, Lady Piton, even in the most unlikely soil." Later, as they walked for the 4th scandalous time, Adrienne pulled Isabel closer than the dance properly allowed. "Take me away from here," he murmured against her ear. "I want you alone." Shocking, my lord," Isabel replied. But her eyes were bright with desire. "Whatever will the guests think? Let them think what they like." 1 year after their wedding, Adrienne stood once again in a church. But this time St. Margaret's was filled with genuine celebration rather than whispered scandal. His sister Margaret was marrying Lord Christopher Ashton, and the ceremony was a riot of flowers and joy. Beside him, Isabel held his hand openly, her other hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Their child would arrive in the autumn. A daughter, Isabel insisted, though she had no logical reason for the certainty. Adrienne found he didn't care either way. The knowledge that he would be a father, that this child would be born of love rather than duty, filled him with fierce protectiveness and wonder. After the ceremony, as they stood in the churchyard watching Margaret and Christopher drive away, in a shower of rose petals, Isabel turned to Adrienne. "Do you remember standing in this very spot? You wouldn't look at me. You were so determined to hate me. I could never have hated you," Adrienne said, pulling her close despite the watching crowds. "I was only trying to hate myself a little less. And now I wake every morning astonished by my good fortune. Now I love you so completely that I cannot remember what it felt like not to love you." He kissed her forehead, then her scarred cheek, then her lips. "You saved me, Isabel, from bitterness, from loneliness, from a half-life of cold duty and colder beds. We saved each other," Isabel corrected softly. "That's what love does, Adrienne. It transforms, it heals. It makes us brave enough to be seen." As they walked back to their carriage, Adrienne glanced back at the church one final time. He remembered standing at that altar, refusing to look, certain his life was ending. How wrong he had been. How gloriously, wonderfully wrong. 5 years later, Blackwood House hummed with life. The east and west wings, once symbols of separation, now connected through hallways filled with the laughter of children. Isabella Maria, called Bella, was indeed a daughter, 4 years old. With her mother's amber eyes and her father's dark hair, her brother Edmund followed 2 years later. And now a third child grew beneath Isabel's heart. The gardens had become Isabel's masterpiece, a fusion of English roses and Spanish herbs that drew admirers from across London. She had published a botanical treatise under her own name, scandalizing some of society and inspiring others. Adrienne had never been prouder. On warm evenings, they still sat together at the pianoforte, Adrienne's playing much improved under Isabel's patient tutelage. Sometimes Bella would climb onto the bench between them, her small hands banging enthusiastically at the keys while her parents laughed. Catherine was a memory now, healed rather than forgotten. Adrienne had finally learned what his father never had, that love freely given was worth infinitely more than duty grudgingly extracted, that the bravest thing a man could do was allow himself to be transformed by the woman who saw past his armor to the wounded heart beneath. One night, as they lay tangled together in the massive bed they shared, Isabel traced lazy patterns on Adrienne's chest. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Agreeing to marry me?" Adrienne captured her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Every day," he said. And when she stiffened, he smiled. "I regret that I wasted even a single moment not loving you, that I was too blind to see the extraordinary gift standing beside me at that altar." "Foolish man," Isabel murmured, but her eyes were bright with tears. "I would have waited forever for you to see me. Thank God you didn't have to." Outside, London settled into sleep. Inside Blackwood House, two people who had met as strangers lay wrapped in each other's arms. Proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with a glance across a crowded room, but with the courage to finally look at what has been standing beside you all along.